My friends, it is a joy to be with you in this moment of quiet reflection. And before we move into the deeper principles of our work, I want to speak directly to that place within you that has endured, that has persisted, that has continued to turn toward the light even when the light seemed far away. For many of you, there have been long seasons when the outer world did not respond to your prayers, when the inner cavity of your being felt empty, when the presence you sought seemed silent. Yet even in that silence, you remained faithful. You continued to seek God, to listen for that still small voice, to lean inward when nothing in the outer sense supported your faith. I would ask you now to pause and recognize the sacredness of that perseverance. For the truth is this: faithfulness in the dark is never wasted. What appears to be delay, what feels like abandonment, is often the very preparation of consciousness required for the experience of grace. We might imagine that God rewards us for holding on. But you see, grace is not a reward. Grace does not appear because of human effort. Grace becomes visible only when effort quietly, gently falls away. So when you look back at those seasons of difficulty, do not think of them as failures or barren passages. Think of them instead as the dissolving of the old self, the self that believed it must accomplish harmony through personal power. In those hours when your prayers seemed unanswered, something profound was taking place. The human sense of, I can do it, I must do it, I must make it happen, was being worn away, not by punishment, but by love. The darkness did not come to defeat you. It came to hollow out the vessel so that it could receive. It came to prepare your consciousness for a life not lived through human will, but through divine activity. You have stayed faithful, not because you were strong, but because something within you knew without words that God is. And now we stand together at the threshold of a higher realization that the God for whom you waited was never absent, that the grace you longed for was never withheld, and that the transformation you desired begins not with effort but with recognition. Today we begin the journey of learning how to live, not by striving, not by pleading, not by the anxiety of personal responsibility, but by the quiet, effortless flow of grace. And the first step is simply to acknowledge the beauty of your endurance, for it has brought you to this place where the inner ear can begin to hear and the inner eye can begin to see. Now, let us turn our attention to a very subtle but deeply rooted belief that operates in nearly every sincere seeker. It is a belief so ingrained, so automatic, that most are not even aware they carry it. And yet it forms the central barrier to experiencing the freedom and harmony of the spiritual life. It is the belief that everything depends upon you, your effort, your discipline, your endurance, your prayers, your strength, your capacity to solve, to overcome, to achieve. This belief is not merely incorrect, it is the source of nearly all spiritual frustration. If you examine your inner reactions during difficult times, you will notice this belief whispering through your mind. I must find the answer. I must push a little harder. I must pray in a stronger way. I must keep God's attention. I must figure out what to do next. And you see, the very moment you accept that mental burden, you become separated, not in truth, for separation is impossible, but in your sense of relationship to God. In that instant, God becomes something external to be reached, persuaded, or activated, and you become the one responsible for initiating divine activity. But I say to you, this is the great illusion. The activity of God does not begin because of your effort, and it does not cease because of your weakness. The harmony of spirit does not depend upon the strength of the individual. Divine intelligence is not waiting for your command. It is functioning eternally, universally, impartially. And your task is never to set God into motion, but to recognize the motion already present. You see, the belief that I must do something to make spiritual truth effective is the essence of personal sense. It is the conviction that I, as a separate being, must accomplish spiritual good. And this is the very root of struggle. As long as you believe you are the one who must achieve harmony, healing, supply, you cannot help but feel anxious because deep within you know you have no such power. And so life becomes a cycle of effort, followed by disappointment, followed by intensified effort, until eventually consciousness becomes weary. This is not a failure. This is grace in disguise. For when personal effort reaches its limit, something within you finally becomes still enough to say, "Father, I cannot, but you already are." In that moment, the shift begins. What we are learning is this: the spiritual life is not lived through human will, but through divine willingness. You do not make the sun rise. You do not make the tide move. You do not animate the breath within your body. These occur through the invisible activity of life itself, and the same principle applies to everything you have been trying to fix, change, or improve. As long as you stand at the center of your efforts, attempting to manage life by your own strength, you will experience the wearying sense of carrying a burden too heavy to bear. But when you begin to release that belief, when you begin to recognize that harmony is not created but revealed, not produced but perceived, then you step out of the way and allow the divine presence to perform its own work in you, through you, and as you. Let us then begin gently to question every inner impulse that says, "I must." Let us begin to watch the subtle ways in which the mind tries to take responsibility for life. And let us learn to replace that burden with a simple recognition: God is the life of my being. God is the activity of my experience. God is the source, the substance, and the law of all good. And I need only witness the unfoldment of that which already is. As we go deeper into this work, let us turn our attention to one of the most misunderstood principles of the spiritual life, the law of grace. I ask you to listen not with the mind that seeks to analyze or compare, but with that inner stillness which alone can receive the truth of spirit. For grace is not a concept to be understood intellectually. It is a living reality that dawns upon consciousness when the personal self recedes. Now, many have been taught implicitly or explicitly that grace is something bestowed by God in response to human behavior, that God rewards the faithful, the obedient, the devout, that grace is some kind of divine compensation for righteous living. But my friends, that is merely a continuation of the human sense of separation, believing that God is far off, observing our conduct, and intervening based on our merit. Grace is not a reward. Grace is not something earned. Grace is not selective. Grace does not come to some and not to others. Grace is the natural activity of the divine presence, always present, always functioning, always complete, waiting only for our recognition. It is the spontaneous, effortless outpouring of God's nature, and because God is infinite, eternal, indivisible, grace is not something God gives. Grace is what God is expressing. You do not receive grace because you ask. You become aware of grace when the asking ends. You do not attract grace through devotion. You become conscious of it when devotion becomes silent, listening. You do not compel grace to act. You witness its action when personal will is surrendered. Do you see the shift? Grace is never the result of your effort. It appears to become active only when effort dissolves. The personal mind, with its ambitions, its fears, its demands and expectations, stands as the only barrier to the experience of grace. Not because grace is absent, but because grace cannot be perceived through the lens of striving. Imagine sunlight pouring through a window. The light does not begin when you open the curtain. It was shining long before. Your act merely allows you to see what has always been present. Grace is precisely this, the eternal presence of divine harmony awaiting recognition. When the curtain of personal sense, fear, effort, planning, control is drawn aside, grace floods consciousness with its natural radiance. So let us be very clear. Grace is not God's response to your need. Grace is not triggered by prayer, nor delayed by doubt. Grace does not come because you have suffered, nor leave because you have failed. Grace is the uninterrupted flow of divine being. It is the law of God's own nature, expressing itself as your life. And this is why a moment of stillness, true stillness, where the anxious striving of the mind subsides, can do more than years of human effort. When you are still, when the mind ceases its attempt to manage life, you become receptive to that which has been flowing toward you from eternity. Grace is not something you attain, it is something you allow. And the beginning of allowing is simply this, the recognition that God is the only presence, the only power, the only activity in your experience. When this becomes more than an idea, when it becomes a living awareness, you will find that grace begins to reveal itself in gentle, quiet, unmistakable ways, not as dramatic miracles, but as harmony, as rightness, as a sense of peace that does not depend on circumstance. Grace is the rhythm of God's universe. And when you cease trying to direct that rhythm, you discover it has been carrying you all along. Let us now look gently and honestly at what you have called your dark seasons. Those periods of life in which the present seemed distant, prayers echoed into silence, and every effort to find spiritual clarity or relief appeared to fall upon barren ground. Many look upon these seasons as failures, as evidence of some deficiency within themselves, or as signs that God was far away. But nothing could be further from the truth. In the spiritual life, darkness is not a punishment. It is a purification. The darkness is the dissolving of the old consciousness, not the withholding of the light. And it is precisely in these seasons that something sacred is taking place beneath the surface of your awareness. You see, the human mind clings desperately to a sense of personal power, its ability to think, to plan, to fix, to create solutions, to manage outcomes. Even the most devout seeker often carries this hidden conviction: if I can pray correctly, if I can meditate deeply enough, if I can maintain the right attitude, then I will bring forth harmony. And so spiritual practice, intended to be an avenue of receptivity, becomes another form of effort. But life, in its divine wisdom, does something very tender. It allows the outer sense of control to crumble. Not to harm you, but to free you. Not to cause despair, but to soften the rigid structure of personal sense For as long as you believe that you must accomplish spiritual good, grace cannot be recognized. As long as you stand at the center of your universe, directing your own healing, your own supply, your own destiny, you cannot perceive the invisible activity of God. So the darkness comes not as an enemy, but as a teacher, and it gently removes every illusion you have relied upon. The feeling of abandonment you experienced was not the absence of God, but the absence of your former sense of self. It was the dissolving of that part of you that believed it must hold life together through effort, and although it felt painful, it was the greatest mercy. It was the preparation of consciousness. Faithfulness in darkness is the turning point of the spiritual journey. For when you continue to trust, even when trust brings no immediate reward, when you continue to sit in silence, even when silence yields no comfort, when you continue to open your heart to God, even when God seems mute, the personal sense begins to surrender. It cannot maintain itself under those conditions. It yields, and in that yielding, a space is created. Into that space, grace flows. The surface of the mind may have felt dry, but in the depths of your being, something was opening, expanding, becoming receptive. The ego was being emptied, and the emptiness, though misunderstood by many, is the doorway to grace. For grace requires a vessel, not a vessel filled with fear or striving or self-will, but a vessel emptied of self-sufficiency. So when you reflect on the dark places you have walked through, do not regret them. Do not imagine they delayed your spiritual progress. They advanced it. They humbled the personal sense, and humility is the soil in which spiritual awareness grows. Your faithfulness, your willingness to keep turning toward a presence you could not feel was the ripening of consciousness. You were being prepared for a life not governed by your own strength, but sustained by the infinite, and the fruit of that preparation is what we now call grace. Let us now move into one of the most transformative practices in this spiritual work, what I have called resting in the Word. And I would like you to approach this not as a technique, not as something to be performed or executed, but as a quiet posture of consciousness in which the striving self finally steps aside and allows grace to reveal itself. You see, the majority of what is called spiritual practice is still rooted in effort. Even when we speak holy words, even when we recite scripture, even when we meditate, there is often a hidden intention behind it. If I do this correctly, something will change. If I concentrate hard enough, I will receive guidance. If I affirm truth long enough, my condition will improve. But all of this is merely the personal mind trying to use spiritual truth as a tool to accomplish a personal desire. It is still the human self attempting to direct the activity of God. The moment you attempt to use truth to change a condition, you step out of truth. For truth is not a hammer to break circumstances, nor a rope to pull blessings down from heaven. Truth exists to be recognized, not manipulated. It reveals what already is. It does not create what is not. Resting in the Word is the gentle shift from using truth to abiding in truth. When you take a statement such as, "I and the Father are one," you do not repeat it endlessly in an attempt to make it true. You do not cling to it like a lifeline. You do not try to force your mind to believe it. Instead, you sit quietly, not demanding, not expecting, not striving to simply be with the truth, until your inner ear hears something deeper than the words. You let the statement settle into your consciousness like a feather floating onto still water. You do not disturb it. You simply rest in it. And as you rest, something remarkable begins to occur. The truth reveals itself from within. It ceases to be a phrase and becomes a living awareness, a presence, a certainty, a recognition, not produced by your mind, but arising from the depth of your being. This is grace in action. It comes not because you earned it, not because you practiced well, not because you disciplined the mind. It comes because you have allowed the mind to be still long enough for the divine to impress itself upon your awareness. Resting in the Word is the doorway from personal effort into divine activity. It is not passive. It is receptive. It is not resignation. It is surrender. It is not disengagement. It is the quiet openness that allows God to reveal God. And you will notice something else. When you rest in a truth, you are not trying to fix anything. You are not addressing a problem. You are not attempting to manifest a result. For the moment you aim truth at a condition, you return to personal sense. Do not use truth as a tool. Let truth be the atmosphere of your awareness. For example, if you face a health challenge, your task is not to oppose it with spiritual statements. Your task is to rest in the truth of being, to sit in the silent recognition that wholeness is the nature of God and therefore the nature of your being. You rest not to produce healing, but to become aware of what has always been true. If you face lack, do not strive to manifest supply. You rest in the truth that infinite abundance is the substance of spirit, and spirit is the essence of your life. You rest not to attract abundance, but to recognize that supply is an inner reality before it is an outer expression. Resting in the Word is the quiet turning from the outer problem to the inner truth of God's presence. And in that resting, something sacred occurs. The mind no longer interferes. The heart becomes receptive, and grace already present, eternally present, begins to flow into conscious awareness. This is the shift from striving to receiving, from effort to surrender, from self-activity to God activity. You do not make it happen. You simply allow what already is. Let us turn now to a truth that very few understand, yet it forms the heart of spiritual unfolding. The greater part of God's activity takes place in silence, beneath the threshold of your conscious awareness. What appears outwardly as stagnation, as spiritual dryness, as unanswered prayer, is often the time of the most profound inner transformation. Only later, sometimes long after the darkness has lifted, does one look back and say, something was happening in me, even when I felt nothing. You see, the human mind is accustomed to measuring progress by outer signs. If something moves, changes, improves, then we believe God is at work. But spiritual growth seldom follows the pattern of outward movement. In fact, the deepest transformations occur before any visible fruit appears. Just as the seed begins its life in darkness, hidden beneath the soil, so too does spiritual awareness take root in the unseen depth of consciousness. When you sat in silence during your most difficult hours, when you prayed and felt no response, when you listened and heard nothing, when you turned toward God, not out of joy, but sheer trust, you were, without realizing it, creating an inner opening. The noise of personal sense, its demands, its expectations, its fears, was slowly being quieted, and into that quietude, divine activity began to flow. But divine activity is subtle. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It does not shake the earth or stir the emotions. It moves quietly, gently, like the tide that withdraws long before the next great wave appears on the shore during your season of silence. False beliefs were being dissolved. The sense of separation was being weakened. The reliance on personal will was being eroded. The ego was loosening its grip. The inner vessel was being emptied so that it could be filled. All of this happened without drama, without external signs, without sensation. This is why so many mistake silence for absence. They think nothing is happening because they cannot feel the divine. But the presence is not always felt. It is often revealed later, after the work is complete. You must understand this. The absence of spiritual feeling does not mean the absence of God. In fact, some of the most sacred work the Spirit ever performs occurs when the personal self feels nothing at all. Think of it this way. If your mind were constantly filled with spiritual comfort or emotional upliftment, the ego would cling to the experience and attempt to reproduce it. The human self would mistake the feeling for God. And so, to protect you from this illusion, the Spirit often works in a way that bypasses sensation entirely. This is why your season of silence was not a spiritual desert. It was a spiritual womb. The new consciousness was forming. The inner structure of your being was being rearranged. Your capacity for grace was expanding. You were being prepared not for a dramatic experience, but for a deeper awareness of God's eternal presence. And now, as you stand here with a heart softened by struggle and a mind made humble by unanswered questions, you are ready to witness what was taking shape all along. You are ready to see that you were not waiting for God. God was preparing you for recognition. God was working in the unseen places of your being, shaping you into a vessel through which grace may flow effortlessly. So let us release any regret for the silent years. Let us bless the darkness that purified us. Let us bless the stillness that emptied us. For without those hidden workings, the consciousness required for grace could not have awakened. You were never alone. You were never forgotten. You were being transformed. As we come to this next phase of our unfolding, let us consider what it means to live by grace, not merely to experience moments of grace, not merely to glimpse its activity in prayer or meditation, but to enter into a state of consciousness where grace becomes the governing principle of daily life. For the spiritual life is not fulfilled on the meditation mat alone, it is fulfilled in the ordinariness of each day, in the passing moments, in the simple activities through which God expresses as your being. Now, you may ask, how does one live by grace? What does it look like? And the answer is both beautifully simple and profoundly transformative. To live by grace is to live from the awareness that God is the only presence and the only power operating as your life. It is to relinquish the belief that you must direct, control, or secure your experience. It is to allow the divine intelligence that governs the universe to govern you. You see, when the personal sense is dominant, life becomes a constant calculation. Every choice is weighed through fear. Every step is taken with tension. The mind tries to plan the future, defend the present, or correct the past. But grace requires none of this, because grace is God in action, and God does not need your permission, your willpower, or your strategies to unfold harmony. Living by grace begins with cultivating a new inner posture, a posture of listening. Not listening for messages, not listening for voices, not listening for emotional guidance, but listening with a quiet expectancy, knowing that divine wisdom is the very fabric of your being, and that its impulse will reveal itself exactly when it is needed. When you face a decision, pause, be still. Do not think your way into an answer. Do not analyze. Do not calculate pros and cons. Turn inward and wait. It may be a few seconds, it may be minutes, but at some point a gentle sense of rightness will arise. Not a thought, not an argument, but a quiet inner knowing. This is grace revealing the next step not as a command, but as an unfoldment. When you live by grace, your actions cease to be reactions. They become expressions. You find that you are not struggling to make life conform to your desires. Rather, life begins shaping itself around the divine rhythm that is moving through you. You discover that there is a flow, subtle yet unmistakable, that carries you. Doors open without your forcing. Opportunities arise without your seeking. Needs are met before they are spoken. And what once felt burdensome becomes effortless. This does not mean that challenges disappear, but the nature of challenge changes. Instead of approaching difficulties with fear, you approach them with an inner assurance that the divine activity is already present within the situation. You no longer say, "How will I fix this?" but, "Father, what is the truth here?" And in the silence that follows, you become aware that the truth is already functioning. Living by grace also means you cease trying to manipulate outcomes. You stop praying for specific forms of supply, healing, or relationship. You stop dictating to God how harmony must appear. Instead, you rest in the awareness that divine intelligence knows the form before you know the need. You trust the invisible more than the visible. When you live by grace, relationships become gentler because you no longer ask others to fulfill your needs. Work becomes more peaceful because you recognize that the activity of your hands and mind is the activity of God expressing itself. Finances become less frightening because you begin to understand that supply is not dependent on outer channels. It flows from an infinite source. You begin to walk through life with a quiet confidence, not the confidence of personal ability, but the confidence of divine sufficiency. You wake each morning not wondering what the day will bring, but opening yourself to the unfolding of God's plan for that day. You move from fear to trust, from effort to receptivity, from human responsibility to spiritual responsiveness. This is what it means to live by grace, to let the divine live your life for you, as you, through you, to become a transparency for the activity of God, to step aside and let the infinite reveal itself in and through your ordinary moments. And when you begin to taste this way of living, even in small measure, you will never again desire to return to a life governed by personal will, for you will know deeply, quietly, that grace is the true law of your being, and that in grace there is no strain, no fear, no lack, only the continuous, effortless outpouring of divine harmony. Now, let us gently turn our attention to the unmistakable signs that grace has begun to govern your life. These signs do not always appear as dramatic changes in circumstance. In fact, they often arise quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. But if you are attentive, not outwardly, but inwardly, you will begin to recognize the subtle fruits of inner rest. These fruits are the evidence that grace has become active in your conscious experience. The first evidence of grace is peace, not emotional peace, not the temporary relief that comes when problems subside, but a deep, abiding peace that is wholly independent of conditions. You may still be surrounded by the same circumstances, but something within you no longer reacts. A stillness forms in the center of your being. and you discover that you are not disturbed by the outer world. This peace is the hallmark of grace, for it arises not from improved conditions, but from the awareness of divine presence. The second evidence of grace is clarity, not the clarity of the analytical mind, but a spiritual clarity, a gentle knowing that comes without effort. Decisions that once frightened you now unfold with ease. You find yourself guided from moment to moment, not through thought or reasoning, but through an inner sense of direction that is unmistakably right. You do not know how you know, but you know, and this knowing is the voice of grace. Then comes a softening of fear. You may notice that the anxieties that once seemed overwhelming now lose their power. They appear like distant echoes. Unable to stir the depths of your being, you discover that you no longer rely on the outer world for assurance, because assurance has arisen from within. This is not denial. It is the recognition that divine presence is the only real security. Another fruit of grace is effortless right action. You begin to notice that your days flow with greater harmony. You meet the right people at the right time. Opportunities present themselves naturally. Obstacles dissolve quietly without requiring your struggle. What seemed difficult now becomes simple, not because the world has changed, but because you are no longer attempting to live through personal will. Grace is doing the work. You will also experience a loosening of attachment to outcomes, to timelines, to personal desires. You no longer cling to specific forms of good. Instead, you rest in the assurance that divine intelligence knows the form better than you do, and because you have released the rigidity of expectation, life can bring you good in ways the human mind could never have imagined. This openness is the soil in which miracles take root. One of the most profound evidences of grace is the dawning awareness that you are not the doer. You begin to see that the harmony unfolding in your life is not the result of your effort, your skill, your strength, or your planning. You recognize that God is the activity of your being, and that every act of good which flows through you is the manifestation of divine presence expressing itself. This awareness brings with it a humility that is not self-deprecating but liberating. You are free from the burden of self-importance, free from the anxiety of earning or deserving, free from the need to control. And finally, grace reveals itself as gratitude without cause, a gratitude that is not tied to any particular blessing, but arises simply from being aware, being alive, being in the presence. You may wake in the morning with a quiet sense of joy for no reason at all. You may sit in stillness with an overflowing heart, not because something wonderful has happened, but because you feel the nearness of God. This is gratitude born of grace, and it is one of the sweetest experiences of the spiritual life. These fruits, peace, clarity, freedom from fear, right action, openness, humility, gratitude, are not accomplishments. They are the natural outpouring of grace. They are signs that the inner rest you have cultivated is bearing fruit in the visible world. And as these fruits ripen, you will find yourself living in a new atmosphere, an atmosphere not of striving but of trust, not of anxiety but of assurance, not of separation but of oneness. You will know, without question, grace is your true state of being, and it has been guiding you all along. As we come gently to the close of this time together, let us gather the threads of what has unfolded within us, not as ideas to be remembered, not as teachings to be followed mechanically, but as living truth that awakening in your consciousness. For what we have spoken of today is not theory, it is the revelation of your own being, and as this truth settles into the quiet chambers of your soul, a new life begins to form. a life not governed by fear or striving, but sustained by grace. You have walked through darkness not as punishment, but as preparation. You have endured silence, not because God withheld himself, but because God was reshaping your inner awareness. And through it all, even when you felt alone, you remained faithful. Now that faithfulness bears fruit, the ground within you has been softened, the walls of personal sense have been thinned, and into that openness grace now flows without obstruction. Do not imagine that you are returning to the life you once lived. You are not. You are stepping into a new dimension of being, a life in which your actions arise from inner peace rather than outer pressure, a life in which your decisions emerge from divine intuition rather than human fear, a life in which your needs are met through the unobstructed activity of the infinite rather than through the anxious efforts of the finite. You are not being asked to become something more. You are being invited to let go of what you never were, the anxious self, the striving self, the self that believed it was separate from God. All of that was an appearance, a temporary shadow cast by the mind. Now you are awakening to the truth that has always been. I and the Father are one. Not two beings, not two forces, not two lives, one. And from this oneness flows every form of good you will ever require. Harmony flows from oneness, healing flows from oneness, supply flows from oneness, peace flows from oneness. But these blessings do not come because you seek them. They appear because you have ceased to seek anything outside yourself and have turned inward to the divine center where all is already complete. My friends, the spiritual journey is not a path of addition, but of subtraction. Not the acquiring of more truth, but the releasing of the personal sense that obscures the truth. And you have, through your faithfulness, through your perseverance, through your willingness to sit in silence, allowed much of that old consciousness to dissolve. You have created space for grace. So now, as you step forward from this moment, do so gently with the quiet assurance that you are not walking alone. The presence that sustained you in darkness now walks with you in light. The grace that worked unseen will now begin to reveal its activity openly, and the life you once struggled to build by human means will unfold naturally through divine means. Let your heart rest in the certainty that all is well, not because the world outside has changed, but because something within you has awakened. Carry with you the awareness that God is not a distant power, but the very life that animates you. And remember always that where your effort ends, the activity of God becomes visible. You are stepping into a new rhythm now, a rhythm of ease, of peace, of inner assurance, a rhythm in which you do not strive, but allow, you do not cling, but release, you do not fear, but trust, a rhythm in which grace becomes the melody of your daily life. Go forward, then, not with effort, but with recognition, not with striving, but with surrender, not with fear, but with the quiet knowing that the grace you sought has always been the grace that carried you. This is your new beginning. This is your new life. This is the effortless light that follows faithfulness in the dark.